Good morning, everyone. Good morning. And thank you, John, for that very kind and generous introduction. I know that that is something that my family and I will always appreciate. So thank you for taking the time to do it so well. And to our families and friends, welcome to the Western Surgical Association. I think it's one of the finest surgical organizations in America. It's characterized by strong science, excellent surgeons, and genuine friendship and fellowship amongst its members. And to those members, I'd like to say a very succinct but very sincere thank you for this year as your president. It is certainly the highlight of my academic career. As is usual and customary, I'd like to thank some of the people that have done so much for me. I'd like to begin with my faculty and teammates at North Shore. I remain honored and privileged to lead such an outstanding group of clinical and academic surgeons, and I so genuinely appreciate the lessons you've taught me about leadership and true partnership. And to my academic chairs at Northwestern, Dave Narwald, my first academic chairman as a medical student, as a resident, and then as a young faculty member. To Dave Winchester, my predecessor as chair at North Shore in Evanston, and my first role model as an academic surgical oncologist. And to one of my all-time favorites, Jimmy Yao, who taught me the most valuable lesson about leading surgeons when he said to me that you must always lead from the operating room, and you better never forget that. From my years at MD Anderson, Charles Balch and Rafe Pollack, who taught me the value of preparation and planning for a career in academic surgery, and to Steve Curley, an extraordinary surgeon and professional colleague, and the best friend I've made in 30 years in academic surgery. To Lee Newmeyer, our secretary, Karen Brazel, our recorder, and Margot Shoup, our treasurer. Ladies, thank you for your help this year. You are extraordinary surgeons and leaders, and I will tell you, I think you're not only great role models for women in surgery, I think you're great role models for all of us. So thank you for your help. To my family, I'd like to begin with my daughter, Brittany. Brittany, you're the most dedicated, determined, and enthusiastic young woman I've ever met. And your care and your compassion for your students and infants with special needs is so admirable that I am humbled to be your father. Every child should be so lucky to have a teacher like you in their lives. To my son, Jason, outdoorsman, explorer, adventurer, and writer. This young man has hiked across Europe, he kayaked the Mississippi River from Minnesota to New Orleans, and he just finished a 3,500-mile bike ride from Colorado to Alaska to raise funds and awareness for Alzheimer's disease. Jason, you're the strongest and most independent man I've ever known, and I admire your strength and your spirit, and you don't ever change. And I will continue to live vicariously through your journeys and your writings. And to both of you, thank you for the balance and equilibrium you've given my life, and thank you for teaching me the genuine and true purpose of fatherhood. To my wife, Ann, hard to put into words what this extraordinary woman has meant to me. She's my best friend, she's a terrific mother to our two children, and she's just been an incredible partner for the last 35 years. And I tell you truthfully, without her love and loyalty, without her support and understanding, there is absolutely no way I'm standing in front of you today without that woman. And her mother, Norma McBride, is here from Cleveland, Ohio. Norma, I'm going to tell you something. You raised 7 children. In terms of the way you raised your daughter, Ann, one thing to tell you. Well done, Mom. Good job, Norma. Good job. So I've entitled my presidential address today, Impact, Insight, and Innovation, Our Legacy of Learning. It's really the story how surgeons in this organization, in the Western Surgical Association, have shared information and knowledge with each other for over 127 years. Let me begin by telling you how I arrived at this title. In October of 2017, Ann and I took a very special trip to Italy. We went back to see the towns where my mother and father's families had immigrated from. My grandfather, Alessandro Talamonti, was born in Italy in 1895, And when he was 7 years old, his parents put him on a boat and sent him to America to meet relatives somewhere in New York City. He had no clue. He was 7 years old. He was on the boat with the idea that they would follow him sometime thereafter. And when Ann and I walked around San Benedetto, it's absolutely a gorgeous seaside town in northern Italy right now. It's bounded by the spiny Apennine Mountains on the west and the rolling blue Adriatic Sea on the east coast. And as we walked around, I kept asking myself, why on earth would anybody leave such a beautiful town? But Italy in 1895 was not so beautiful. The country was fractured by decades of civil wars over national unification. This left it with a legacy of violence, social chaos, and widespread poverty. Diseases and natural disasters swept through the new nation, and there was really no central government there to aid the people or the citizens. The agricultural and fishing economies collapsed, and there was little progress toward industrialization. And San Benedetto was not immune to that political unrest, poverty, and hopelessness. The male population of the town had been severely reduced as the young boys were conscripted and drafted to fight in the doomed armies and navies of the time. That beautiful seaside bay was polluted and clogged with shipwrecks and the remnants of war. In the late 1890s, 2 major cholera outbreaks in northern Italy reduced that area's population by over 50%. And conditions like that all over Europe led to the mass immigration of the early 20th century, when between 1890 and 1920, over 12 million European immigrants left their homes and went to the land of hope and opportunity. And they formed the primary labor force for the major U.S. industrialization of the early 20th century. But their life was hard. The U.S. was ill-prepared to absorb such a large number of new immigrants, and they were met with poor living conditions, hard labor at low wages, and ultimately resentment and legal legislation trying to restrict the flow of new immigrants to America. Sound familiar? And nonetheless, few people gave up and went home. My grandparents all came over on those boats, all 4 of them, some legally, some illegally. They had families, they raised children, they became part of America. My grandfather, that young boy Alessandro I told you about, actually became a pretty famous race car driver in the roaring 20s. He was known as Sonny Talamonti. And their children, Alice Zarlingo and my father, John Talamonti, met, married, and did an absolutely fabulous job raising my sister Cheryl and me. And they lived all the dreams and experiences that Tom Brokaw wrote about so beautifully in his wonderful book entitled The Greatest Generation. So you're probably wondering, why am I telling you this immigrant tale? Because soon after Ann and I came back from Italy, I was elected president of the Western Surgical Association. And I knew I would spend that year learning not just about the history of the Western Surgical Association, but those forces and factors which have shaped our personality and indeed the spirit of the Western Surgical Association. And interestingly, just as that European mass immigration was happening, 100 years of westward expansion across the Great Plains and over the Rocky Mountains was peaking between 1860 and 1920. It was driven by population expansion in the northeastern United States and the availability of cheap, fertile land and the opportunity for individual land ownership. Sometimes understated in the history books was political freedom for those seeking to avoid the discord of slavery and the taxation and loss of life to fight against it. The California Gold Rush of 1849 offered the dream of riches in the land west of the Rocky Mountains. The completion of the first transcontinental and Union Pacific Northwest railroads in 1869 made the transportation of masses west feasible, but also sustainable. But nothing energized westward expansion more than the Homestead Act of 1862, which made over 270 million acres of public land available for those brave enough to make the journey. And 1.6 million homesteaders took that challenge and headed west. Their enduring symbol and our proud emblem, the covered wagon. But make no mistake about it, their life was hard too. They required the same strength and courage as all those European immigrants. and they were met with the same pain and hardship. And amidst all that uncertainty and that deprivation, there was an unequivocal calling for more and better medical care. And thus, the Western Surgical Association began in 1891. We started out as the Western Association of Obstetricians and Gynecologists with 42 charter members. Remember that the American Surgical Association had already been founded 11 years earlier in 1880 in the more populated northeastern states. And then the Southern Surgical Association was founded in 1887 in the resurgent South after the Civil War. Our first president, Milo Ward, in his presidential address in Topeka, Kansas in 1891, wrote, "We are so much cut off from the East and South that it is imperative that we create for ourselves a society that will foster the true scientific spirit and give us a better knowledge of each other. Let us not despise the day of small things, although we are few in number and as yet unrecognized by the medical surgical world." In 1895, we became the Western Surgical and Gynecologic Association, and in 1909, we became the Western Surgical. Our meetings were 2 days long, lasting from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., with working sessions in the morning, afternoon, and evening. The presidential address and the case discussions occurred during a very modest dinner banquet. Not unexpectedly, the content addressed the diseases, concerns, and perspectives of the times. The programs were purely clinical, reflecting the paucity of medical schools and academic clinics in the region at that time. But what was crystal clear as you read through the transactions of the Western Surgical Association was the undeniable and unrelenting need for surgeons to meet and to communicate with each other and exchange new technical approaches and to share their experiences and outcomes with each other. For over 127 years, the Western Surgical Association has been a shining example of how surgeons learn and share information with each other. From the beginning of the early 20th century, when we were led by pioneers like Charles Mayo, and the advances were in pure clinical surgery, and those advances had such a profound impact on our surgeons and the patients they served. To the middle of the 20th century, after the country had survived 2 consecutive world wars, led by surgeon scientists like Warren Cole, who incorporated the scientific method to provide scientific insight into our most vexing and chronic clinical problems. And then, at the end of the 20th century, and as we turn the corner into the new millennium, led by leaders like Claude Organ, who ushered in an incredible era of innovation in technology, informatics, and personalized surgical care. And in the early years of the organization, the impact and inspiration of new knowledge amongst its members was almost palpable in the readings. The presentations then had the look and feel of a modern surgical grand rounds, where a resident might get up, present a few cases, review the literature, and then the attendings would go have at it. It was clearly the era of how to do surgery. The emphasis on the presentations was on making a clinical diagnosis with rudimentary clinical testing, and then the critical technical maneuvers used to guide surgical strategy. The discussions were lengthy, serious, vigorous, and passionate. One that caught my attention as someone who operates on the liver and pancreas was a presentation by Byron Davis in 1910. Byron Davis was a professor of surgery at the Omaha Medical College, later to become the University of Nebraska Medical School. Davis's presentation was entitled Surgical Diseases of the Biliary Passages. It consisted of 3 case presentations, one on cholangitis and gallstones, one on malignant biliary obstruction, and the third case was on a traumatic injury of the bile ducts. His presentation took 20 minutes long. The discussion afterwards took 25 minutes long, and the entire discourse filled up 44 pages in the annual transactions of the Western Surgical Association that year. Nowadays, we would deride that presentation and say it's a single institution, indeed a single surgeon presentation, statistically underpowered, with questionable clinical outcomes. But back in the day, that was the lifeblood of this meeting, absolutely the lifeblood of the meeting. And as you read those presentations, you realize the impact emotion had on learning. And as my daughter Brittany went through her academic journey with her undergraduate degree in elementary education from Arizona and then her master's degree from the University of Denver. Brittany would share with me some of the books and articles that she found interesting and that she knew I would find interesting about how people learn things. And one book she shared with me was by Antonio Damasio, entitled Descartes' Error. And Damasio is a PhD neuroscientist at the University of Southern California. And he studies the way people learn and the way that their memories are created. And he emphasizes the impact of emotion on learning. He states that the creation of an enduring or non-transient memory, unique in its intensity, and thus not requiring the usual need for repetition and reinforcement to assure sustainability of the memory. That's how surgeons learn. Descartes would say that surgeons need only repetition and cognitive awareness to give us the tools to function as surgeons. Damasio would counter and say that repetition and cognitive awareness only give you the tools. They don't give you the knowledge. And that emotions and intense memories give us the knowledge of how best to use those skills. And because every layer of the brain, every part of the brain is stimulated when a surgeon learns, in Damasio's hierarchy of learning, he would say that surgery is the ultimate cognitive specialty. And I would hope that right now every surgeon in the room can think back on their career and remember a time, a patient, a case, a surgical encounter with an attending in an operating room that was so powerful and so impacted and so impactful that that encounter is embedded in their surgical DNA forever. For me, it happened twice at Northwestern. Once when I was a medical student operating with Jerry Ujiki on the right, and later on when I was a surgical resident operating with his partner Stu Patisha on the left. And I will tell you, both were proud members of the Western Surgical Association. Jerry Ujiki, when I was a medical student on his service, I was absolutely enthralled by the man. He was a quiet professional, an incredible depth and knowledge of general surgery. And then I went to the operating room and watched him operate. And he was exquisite, smooth, gentle, the tissue never tore, the knots never broke. And after one day in the operating room with Jerry Ujiki, I knew I was going to be a surgeon. I just knew it. Then a few years later, I operated with his partner, Stu Patisha. I was a senior resident then, and Dr. Patisha was bigger than life. Another technical maestro, just a fantastic surgeon and a charismatic person. Somebody who turned every operating room into a theater of learning. And I'd be in there doing a right lobectomy with him or a Whipple procedure, and the case could be going just perfectly. And then all of a sudden he would look at me and he would say, "What are you going to do if the right hepatic vein tears off the vena cava? Or what are you going to do if there's a posterior laceration on the portal vein?" And the case was going perfectly. And I would pause and freeze, and then I would mumble and stumble and bumble some inane answer about clamps and sutures and shunts and all that. And when he was done shaking his head, no, 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 then he would pause. And he would return to his time as a military surgeon in Vietnam. And he would tell me those moments that were so impactful in his training. Maybe it was a gunshot wound through and through the liver. Maybe it was a shrapnel wound to the posterior head of the pancreas. But I will tell you, he told those stories, and I was absolutely mesmerized, and I never forgot those stories. And some of the residents that are in the audience now, 30 years later, I'm telling them the same stories as if it happened to me. And so I would tell all the young surgeons in the room that when you present at meetings like this, your presentations do not have to be a mindless or unemotional recitation of statistics, outcomes, and the limitations of my data. And remember, it's those presentations which inspire us, which stir our imaginations, which have the most enduring impact and are held in the highest esteem by your surgical colleagues. By the end of World War I, American leadership had ascended on the international stage, and that was certainly true in surgery. Advances in the basic sciences like microbiology, pharmacology, endocrinology, physiology, and cancer biology provided scientific insight and enlightened our craft. Large institutional clinical reports provided the wisdom of experience and directed relevant scientific research like no other field in medicine. And taken together, these new surgeon scientists unified the profession and turned what had been an art and a craft into a scientific specialty. Quite simply, it was no longer about how to stop the bleeding, drain the pus, and cut out the lump. and more about how to think about the body's physiologic responses to hemorrhage, sepsis, and cancer so that we could do better for our patients and improve our outcomes. No one addressed this new surgical scientist better than Joseph Eastman in his presidential address of 1916, entitled The Old Art and the New Science of Surgery. Eastman wrote, "Surgery must still be heroic. Gross anatomy cannot be abridged. Pathology is still a great basal factor in rational surgical practice, but it is the biologist surgeon, standing upon all the proved knowledge of the art and his experience and of the science as well, whose viewpoint is highest and whose impact is greatest." As I read through the archives of the Western Surgical Association, there were countless examples of surgical scientists who used the scientific method to advance our profession. But three stood out to me. One was J. Bradley Oust, president of the Western Surgical Association in 1989, an extraordinary clinician and a true scientist. This man made scientific advances in transplant immunology, cardiac physiology, and surgical oncology. Then there were others, like Basil Pruitt, president of the Western Surgical in 1994, who had a laser beam focus on burns and trauma. And he made sentinel discoveries in wound sepsis, skin grafting, fluid resuscitation, and nutritional support for burn patients. And then there were other people like Ray Yale, one of my favorites from Northwestern, who morphed during the various stages of his career. Ray began as a basic scientist who studied the physiology of acute and chronic pancreatitis. And then later on, he became interested in surgical education. And again, applying the scientific method, he made scientific contributions presented at this meeting about how surgeons would learn the new techniques of laparoscopy in minimally invasive surgery. And then in the latter third of his career, when he went to the VA system full-time, again, applying scientific methodology, he made contributions in terms of patient safety, quality improvement, and performance metrics in the VA healthcare system. And these are just three examples, but they were the ones that stood out to me of surgeons who combined the scientific method with their clinical perspectives and their own inherent clinical curiosity to generate new knowledge and take better care of sick people. Now, all of our faculty at North Shore have academic appointments at the University of Chicago. So that means a couple of times a month, I go down to Hyde Park to meet with Jeff Matthews or Mitch Posner to talk about the residency program or shared clinical interests. And as I walk through the halls at the University of Chicago, there's a picture on the wall. This is a picture of Charles Huggins. He's a very famous University of Chicago surgeon who won the Nobel Prize in Medicine as a surgeon in 1966 for his research, his basic science research on prostate cancer. And above his picture in the hallway is a sign that hung above the door in his lab. And it says, "Discovery is our business." And as I was walking through the halls getting ready for the talk months ago, I saw that sign. And then as I read the more recent proceedings of the Western Surgical Association, it kind of struck me that innovation and creativity are truly our highest form of academic accomplishments and contributions to this profession. Because innovation and creativity require not only the insight of science and the wisdom of clinical experience, but also the inquisitiveness, conviction, and courage to take risks in the pursuit of improving care for the sick and suffering. And yet, our greatest challenge to innovation and creativity is our own willingness to change. In her book entitled Wired to Resist, Britt Andriotta talks about how human beings are just genetically wired. It's in our DNA. We don't like change and we don't like unpredictability. We're genetically wired to seek safety in constancy and predictability. Which one of us as a surgeon hasn't either uttered these words or heard them? I've done this operation 100 times. I know exactly the steps. I know exactly how it's going to turn out, and I'm not changing a thing. This is how I do it, right? And change requires not only energy, but also risk without immediate reward. And what surgeon in this room doesn't love the exhilaration and the immediate reward when they pick up a scalpel and slay a dragon for a patient, and that patient's better almost immediately? It's It's intoxicating. It's so exciting to see those patients get better so quickly. Why would you change that? And surgeons achieve mastery with repetition as we seek consistent quality for our patients. Yet these same behaviors retard growth and innovation and progress. No one described these challenges to change better than Charles Lockwood in his presidential address in 1921, entitled The General Surgeon, Past, Present, and Future. In 1921, Lockwood wrote, "Repetition and consistency lead to technical mastery, and we must incorporate scientific advances into clinical care with speed and efficiency while never compromising patient care and safety." And he wrote that the accelerating turnover of new medical knowledge and incredible technologic advances mandates a willingness to change and adapt. And ladies and gentlemen, if that was true in 1921, you know it's even more true in the 21st century, as the turnover in medical knowledge happens so rapidly and sometimes so radically. Another important friend and mentor in my career has been Rich Prinz. Rich Prinz came to us in 2009 after 15 years as chair of surgery at Rush. And Rich Prinz was also a past president of the Western Surgical Association in 2003. And since I've gotten to know Rich, he and I, when he first came to North Shore, we would have a lot of conversations about how to build an academic surgery department at a hybrid place like North Shore. And Rich told me to recruit surgeons with an academic heart and to build around them a culture of investigation, scholarship, and curiosity. And he told me to have the courage and the confidence to change things myself. And as I thought back on my conversations with Rich, and as I read some of the newer presentations in our great organization and great association, I realized that we truly have the most extraordinary profession on the planet. It's an incredible profession because we can learn something new every single day if we keep an open mind. And if we do that, we'll spend our lives and our careers as surgeons never bored, never bored. And for me, an eye-opening experience has played out over the last decade. It started here at the Western Surgical in 2008. I came to this meeting and I heard a gifted young surgeon, a real innovative mind named Michael Kendrick, present a paper in 2008 at Santa Fe about his early experience with total laparoscopic pancreatic duodenectomy at the Mayo Clinic. And he showed that it was feasible, that he could do it safely, but I will tell you, I was wired to resist. I was 50-some years old, I'd done hundreds of Whipples, and I sat in that audience and I said, I'm not changing. I'm stubborn, I'm skeptical, and I know how to do a Whipple, and I can do it fast and quick and safe, and why should I change? Then he put the video up, and I'll tell you, I watched his video, and I was inspired. It was challenging to watch those. A few years later, one of our Northwestern medical students and a Northwestern resident named Melissa Hogue, she'd gone on to great success at the University of Pittsburgh, and she and her teammates at the University of Pittsburgh crafted a robotic training program. And I saw Melissa present this paper at an international meeting. It was entitled Training in Minimally Invasive Pancreatic Resections, or Robotic Whipple Procedures, a paradigm shift away from see one, do one, and teach one. And she had crafted a formal curriculum with progressive skill acquisition accompanied by intensive feedback and a graded evaluation process. So I knew then that all those things that Michael Kendrick had shown me years earlier that were feasible and potentially doable in a gifted surgeon like his hands could be learned, and that I could train and maybe be able to do it. Again, be it with a robot, but nonetheless, that this transformation, this change, wasn't out of bounds for a surgeon in his 60s. So I took a 3-week sabbatical. I went to Pittsburgh in February of 2017. I spent 3 weeks at the University of Pittsburgh, and I was fully immersed in their robotic surgery program and their care pathways. And after a lot of preparation, practice, and proctoring, we did our first robotic Whipple at North Shore in 2017. But I'm not here this morning to talk to you about the pros and cons of minimally invasive surgery for pancreatic cancer versus a traditional open approach. And I'm not about to debate robotic versus laparoscopic versus open. That's not the point I want to make this morning. But I will tell you something. When I did that first robotic Whipple procedure, it was simultaneously the most intimidating, exhilarating, terrifying, and exciting experience I had in the last 20 years. And when that first one was done, I couldn't wait to do the second one. So I would challenge every surgeon in the room to go home this year and learn something new. Try a new technology. Change a technique that you haven't changed in decades. See if you can get better. And if you don't want to do that, participate in a national quality database and compare your outcomes against an external national benchmark and see if you're as good as you think you are. And if you're not, change. It'll make you a better surgeon. It'll help you take better care of your patients. And as my son Jason has taught me, every grand adventure begins with a bold first step. So ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, our scholarship impacts our patients in the most profound way, and it inspires our trainees. Our research is unique in its combination of scientific insight and clinical wisdom, and it helps to save lives more directly than any other field in medicine. And our ability to innovate and create is simultaneously our greatest challenge, an immense responsibility, and an awesome opportunity to change the way sick people are cared for. And our generation of new knowledge is a noble calling. It's a noble calling. And the Western Surgical Association has been and will remain a valuable resource for our patients and our surgeons. Thank you all very much for this year as your president.